No one OEM or sector, the solar sector, the wind sector, the batteries, whatever, wants to be the cause of the next blackout. They want to provide a high quality product at least cost, though. What drives quality? Regulations, requirements, and markets. We've got to bring up requirements.
Solar, wind, and battery projects are displacing fossil fuel assets in an urgent push to address the threats of climate change. But the race to decarbonize has created a new problem. In the absence of clear reliability standards, inverter-based resources are misbehaving and messing up the grid, despite repeated warnings. I'm John Engel, Editor-in-Chief of Renewable Energy World, and this week on Factor This, I'm joined by Ryan Quint, who oversees engineering and security integration for the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which manages the bulk power system. Quint shares why the sprint to deploy clean energy assets is leaving the grid vulnerable to reliability failures, and why the US can't slow walk a fix. That's all next on Factor This from Renewable Energy World. Ryan Quint, thanks so much for joining the Factor This podcast. It's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So before we dive into this very interesting and important discussion about the reliability of renewable energy and battery storage projects in the field, can you start us off by sharing a bit about your background and NERC's role in this issue before we get too far down the road?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So a little about me. I've been in the industry for about 15 years now. Started my career at the Bonneville Power Administration. Also worked at Dominion Energy and got my master's and PhD from Virginia Tech and joined NERC about 9 years ago now. And today I'm the Director of Engineering and Security Integration at NERC. And for those that aren't intimately familiar with what NERC is, we're the not-for-profit regulatory authority whose mission is to assure the effective and efficient reduction of risks to the reliability and security of the bulk power system. So we develop and enforce reliability standards, we conduct annual assessments, we monitor the grid through situational awareness, and then we train and educate and certify industry personnel. And so our jurisdiction focuses solely on the bulk power system, and there's specifically the bulk electric system definition used particularly for standards and compliance activities. But my team works collaboratively with industry stakeholders to proactively mitigate risks when we're looking ahead, right? So what are the emerging risks coming at us as a grid kind of holistically, and what can we do to proactively mitigate those risks? What faint signals can we identify? What are the root causes of the challenges that we're facing? And then what types of mitigations can we put into place? So we don't focus in on local distribution challenges, but we obviously have to sort of think about the interplay between distribution and transmission and generation when we're looking forward at emerging risk mitigation.
And so as a regulatory body, you're assessing, the impacts to the grid and events that occur, but you as NERC are not handing out fines or penalties as a regulatory body may in other capacities, right?
So we have multiple departments or components of NERC, right? And so our team is really solely reliability focused, and we're working collaboratively with the industry. We also have our regional entities, which NERC and our regional entities have compliance assurance departments as well as enforcement departments. So we are working collaboratively with industry to develop the standards and then enforce those standards. That is something that my team, there's sort of a strict firewall up where my team does not get involved with entity-specific compliance and enforcement activities. We do share, these are some of the challenges that we see broadly as an industry, but no, we don't work specifically with those departments, but they do exist.
So you're the crime scene investigator, not necessarily the judge or attorney general, right? Is that fair to say?
To my my family members and folks I meet on in public, I say, well, my claim to fame is that when a blackout happens, it's sort of NERC's role and my role to figure out what happened with the industry colleagues, which is kind of it clicks with people. So,
well, I wanted to call you a grid cop, but I'm not sure that's wholly accurate. So maybe we'll have to workshop that a little bit more. So acknowledging that this episode is going to get pretty wonky, but as I mentioned, I do think it's incredibly important as we talk about this race to decarbonize and bring more clean energy projects onto the grid. obviously acknowledging the threat of climate change. But to set the stage a little bit, I initially reached out to you after NERC released its report on the 2023 Southwest Utah disturbance, where 9 large-scale solar projects totaling 921 megawatts of generation failed to ride through a normally cleared vault on a 345 kilovolt transmission circuit. But more than just that event was this commentary from NERC that caught my eye. The quote is, "This report, along with past reports, illustrates and reiterates the strong need for inverter-based resource performance issues to be addressed by generator owners in a timely manner." You went on to say, the organization in its report went on to say, GOs, generator owners, are often not addressing performance issues that latently exist within the existing fleet. All of the causes of abnormal performance in this event have been previously documented by NERC in past reports. However, actions were not taken either by the generator owners or by the inverter original equipment manufacturers, OEMs, to mitigate these known risks. So I read that because this isn't the first time that I'd seen NERC flag the reliability of IBRs, but this seemed to be the sternest rebuke, at least in recent memory. Can you frame for us a little bit about how IBRs are impacting the grid and why this is so serious and why NERC needs to use language like this when speaking to the industry?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's in some important context to set, right? So let's take a kind of a broad step back a little bit. IBRs or inverter-based resources are those that interface to the grid through an inverter, right? Which is a specific device. And so these are modern wind turbines. There's spinning blades that are connecting to a rotor, which is a machine up in the nacelle, and that power is then being converted to AC electric power through an inverter box. Same thing with solar. You have these massive arrays of solar panels which create a DC source, which then has to be converted to AC power through a box. And so if you look closely at those pictures of massive solar plants, you see these little white boxes all over the place, and those are the inverters. Same thing with battery energy storage, but also the same thing with fax devices like StatComs, SVCs, even HVDC circuits. Those are inverter-based technologies, and they're proliferating on the grid fairly rapidly, as we know, right? And so IBRs present a ton of benefits, right? We often have to assume the role of highlighting the challenges, but there are a lot of benefits that we have to acknowledge, right? They can rapidly ramp up and down. They provide a tremendous amount of flexibility, very, very fast regulation services, very fast frequency response, very fast voltage control. Fast is not always good, but in many cases, right, the ability to move these things very quickly to do what we need is really important, right? And many of them have no moving parts, which simplifies things quite greatly, right? The entire power system we know today was built around large synchronous generators, right? These huge spinning masses. And we've designed all of our protection and control systems around that. Well, that's now going away, being replaced by things that have no moving parts. They're just power electronic devices that are programmed to do certain things. But to unlock those benefits, we have to sort of overcome some of the challenges with the new technology, right? And so when we're at, say, a penetration level of 2%, 5%, et cetera, we don't necessarily need to rely on those resources. They rely on the grid to some extent. And that's the history of inverter technology, right? And the distribution related IEEE standards for early rooftop solar were sort of built that way. When the grid hiccups, get off was the simplified version of the standards, right? Now we've come, that's 25 years ago. We've come a very long way to a really rigorous, robust equipment standard now that provides services to the grid and capabilities for these resources to support the grid and provide these essential reliability services for the grid. And so we've really been focused on tackling kind of that most fundamental aspect of this relatively new technology over the last decade or so. What will it take for the grid to remain reliable, resilient, and secure during this rapid transition towards increasing levels of inverter technology? And so we've published an IBR risk mitigation strategy that has an array of things in it, ranging from analyzing these large disturbances and identifying root causes to looking forward, developing best practices using the new technology, to industry outreach and education, as well as NERC registration standards and compliance type activities. So very different ways in which the IBRs can impact the grid, if you will.
So maybe using that Southwest Utah disturbance as an example, and we can draw from other case studies as well, but I've heard you refer to these resources as misbehaving on the grid. So we mentioned that report that led me to reach out to you in the first place was a good amount of solar tripping offline or failing to ride through a normally cleared fault on the transmission system. What do you mean by misbehaving, and why is that such a big issue? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah, so misbehaving is a term I think we use to drastically simplify the challenge that we have, right? We're trying to speak to a very broad audience. And so
I have a 2-year-old, Ryan, so my thoughts go directly to navigating the toddler experience.
Yeah, so I have a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, so I will try to refrain from using words like fussing or things like that.
Yeah, I'm going to take it easy on you with this interview because I can only imagine what you're going through, but go on.
Yeah, so when these resources, are doing things that are unexpected or abnormal, they're performing in ways in which we would not expect them to be. We're sort of calling that misbehaving, right? Because we plan, design, build, construct, commission, and then operate these plants with assumptions that they will be doing certain things. They can ride through basic grid events. They can provide voltage control. They are able to follow ramp rates, those types of things. And when they veer off of that for whatever reason, that's what we refer to when we mean misbehaving. And so, like you said, when we have a normal grid fault, and these things happen all the time, right? A tree falls over and hits a line. A balloon blows up into a power line. A squirrel climbs on a substation bus, right? They happen a lot. And when we have a normal grid event like that, and we lose power from dozens of solar PV facilities, hundreds or maybe even 1,000 inverters all at the same moment in time, that's a potential recipe for a catastrophically bad day, right? So these events that we've been analyzing are not making the news. They're not resulting in blackouts. That's a good thing. They're very early indicators of potential systemic problems that we can then try to get out in front of, and we need to get out in front of before they grow and get bigger and bigger and become a really, really bad day. And as an industry, we collectively all very much get behind that. Sort of whether you're a equipment manufacturer, a developer who's trying to build plants, or you're a utility who's trying to serve customers, no one wants the grid to go down. That it's a societal failure, right? And we do what we need to make sure that doesn't happen. And so, for example, in that event, 900 megawatts is a lot of megawatts, right? For folks that don't work in the words of megawatts, that's a significant amount of power provided to homes, for example. And if we maybe fast or go back to 2022, we had a large event in West Texas where we lost almost 2,500 megawatts of resources, wind, solar and synchronous generation. And so the combination of those two is just further exacerbating that potential for a really bad day, right? And you put it into Google, right? 2,500 megawatts is upwards of 1 million plus homes, right? It's almost infeasible to think about. It's a serious amount of power, and it's like a rubber band, right? The rubber band can be pulled and stretched, and the grid can handle certain things, but if you pull that rubber band too hard or too fast, it snaps, right? And the grid is a really good analogy rubber band is a good analogy for how the grid remains stable and connected together.
How often is this happening? Like you mentioned that in this last report that I referenced, the Southwest Utah disturbance, that NERC has noted these issues previously. How frequently are these events where IBRs are unable to ride through normal grid events occurring?
We've published, I think, over a dozen reports over the last 7 years or so. Some of those reports have multiple events analyzed within them, and there are many, many more events that we don't end up writing reports on because they're smaller, right? And so like I said, that's not dozens of blackouts, right? That's not dozens of power outages. That's dozens of faint signals that give us really useful information that we can then go work proactively with the industry to try to overcome them before they become a real world issue, right? And so that's kind of what my department does, is try to solve the future problems today before they become real problems in the future.
Well, and just adding another layer on why we're talking about this in the first place, I think I've said it a number of times previously on this show that we're reaching a level of maturity in the clean energy industry that, for the most part, we know how to build solar projects. We know how to, for the most part, deploy batteries. Now we're reaching this stage of that they need to work. So what we promise not only to utilities and to regulators, but also investors, is that they work for as long as we say they're going to work, and that they can survive normal events like these grid events or extreme weather events, so on and so forth. And to deliver a false bill of goods would be a major mistake by this industry, and could send it the opposite direction. While we're experiencing this meteoric growth now, if these things don't provide what they're supposed to, that's a major challenge. And so that's what interests me most. And when I get the questions about, what are you covering and what trends are you following, I'm now shifting more into the O&M side of, once it's turned on, what is it doing? How long is it working? And what is it doing in the field? So to that point, then when these events occur, can you walk me through how NERC assesses the impact and what your team goes through in dissecting the culprit? So I guess we're leading the conversation more to the what happens and why.
Yeah. So NERC, we have a really neat event analysis process, which is a collaboration with industry, and it's outside of our compliance assurance activities entirely. And through that process, NERC and our regional entities, we work with the affected utility, the system operator, who first identifies that event, reports it to us, and then we'll issue, for example, RFIs to the affected asset owners. We'll get a kind of a brief event report from the utility, and then we go in and we do a deep dive analysis. And so we request and require a bunch of data to be provided to us: inverter logs, oscillography data, plant level data. And that allows us to go in and look at each of the inverters, the plant level controller, all the different equipment, and say, okay, what happened? What caused this event to happen at this specific location? And in most cases, fairly enough, the entity, the solar entity or battery, entity, the owner, doesn't really know that a major grid event has happened and dozens of these plants have tripped off, right? Because they don't have the purview of that. So we often will sort of educate, this is what happened. You, along with, a half dozen or a dozen other facilities, also did the same thing, kind of disappeared unexpectedly. And we're here to help. We're here to try to mitigate this. We don't want you tripping off. Tripping off is loss of megawatts, loss of revenue. We all want you to stay remaining connected to the grid. And so they're generally very open to working with us to try to fix these problems. And so we'll work collaboratively with those affected entities. We'll bring in the equipment manufacturer and have a sit down and say, okay, what happened? Here's what happened. Why is this happening? And in some cases, there's an easy fix. Setting was wrong. Plant was commissioned with somebody fat fingered a setting or something like that. Or maybe there's a firmware update to the inverter that hasn't been rolled out that solves something that only the manufacturer could fix, right? And so we all kind of get on the same page and say, okay, let's fix these things. That usually is very, very effective, right? Now the challenge is how do we message those findings to the thousands of other facilities that are already existing in the system, plugging along, producing megawatts, being reliable, but possibly having some of these latent risks or latent challenges embedded, and as we learn more, we try to work collaboratively with the industry to proactively mitigate those things.
Yeah, and you want this to be a part of the design process at the outset so that we're not running into these issues once the projects are commissioned. And you just rattled off a few of those technical challenges and reasons for the incidents occurring, but can you go into a little bit more depth on what's happening here and maybe why it's happening here, and where the break in the chain is that you have to go in and educate generator owners and the OEMs themselves to kind of fit what the grid needs?
Yeah. So let's take a step back, I guess, and do a little history lesson, if you will.
Please
Hit kind
do.
of the highlight reel of some of these large events. And if you go to the, for listeners, if you go to the NERC website, you can go to major event reports under our event analysis page, and you'll get hundreds and thousands of pages of these reports that'll either very much excite you or put you right to sleep, depending on your level of technicality.
or scare the shit out of you. That's the third. That's option C. That there are that many events to scroll through. I appreciate NERC for judiciously uploading all of those documents and allowing us to scan through them, but the volume can be a little daunting.
It is. And we've tried to sort of consolidate down the messages, right? And so before I go through the history, that's kind of the Southwest Utah event that you reached out. There's the main message was, in terms of all the technical meaty chapter material, there's nothing new. It's a boring event for the folks that are craving that next new cause of tripping, right? Nothing, right? So let's focus on more of these systemic challenges, and that's what that report highlighted. But each event is different in some respect, right? It's not like we have one problem and we just aren't fixing it. We're uncovering new problems each time, and those new problems we can sort of trace back to a similar root cause, but they're all different and require really extensive, really sharp engineering analysis to understand. We've worked with the national laboratories and Department of Energy, et cetera, to really dig into uncovering why some of these things are happening, because we really aren't able to find the root cause in some points. And that's all been tremendously valuable. So if we go back, we had the Blue Cut fire in 2016. That was the infamous 1,200 megawatt reduction of solar plants across a dozen plus facilities. And really, that was the first major event we had seen. And when you go from zero, right, not having really seen many events, to 1,200 megawatts in the blink of an eye, it scares you, right? Like you said, right? Is this going to exponentially grow and turn into 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 megawatts events that are going to take the grid down? Well, what we found in that event was there was really one equipment manufacturer that had embedded settings in their frequency protection that were just kind of set wrong. They were set based on logic of power electronics and not logic of power systems. And so when a grid fault happens, they all disappear and they all trip off. That's a success story, actually, because that equipment manufacturer rolled out an update to its entire fleet, and that problem has disappeared, and we've never seen it again for that inverter manufacturer, right? That's a success story, actually. Scary event, but actually a major success story, that these inverter manufacturers are able to roll out fixes to these things if they are choose to and are willing to and can, etc. Now, sometimes that takes people on site and a lot of resources and time, but they're doable, right? They're not insurmountably challenging problems. 2017, we then had the Canyon 2 fire disturbance. We like to give each of these a kind of a fun, silly name so that they stick in our brain a little bit. and this one was voltage-related problems. Inverters tripping on voltage type stuff, which has more to do with the way the equipment is designed and built, in the lab and rolled out commercially. New OEMs, new issues, new findings. So a lot of new things there. 2018, we had two events in California, similar look and feel to the past, the Canyon 2 disturbance. So nothing really exciting there, but we did issue alerts and start sharing information broadly with the industry. And then 2019, we didn't have an event. We thought, wow, this is neat.
We did it.
Good problem to have. We did it. Problems have kind of gone away. And then 2020, we had another event in Southern California, more findings, analysis, outreach. We started building our large stakeholder initiatives, establishing really great collaboration. We've got our inverter-based resource subcommittee under our stakeholder groups that has a listserv of 500 people or something like that. So really a great community of experts that are trying to solve these problems. And then in 2021, we had the first Odessa event. There's two Odessa events, quite infamous events if you work in this sort of niche area. Major event in Texas, 1,300 megawatts tripped offline. And the main finding there was those facilities were brand new, essentially. Texas has gone from nearly no solar in the mid-2010s to an explosion of solar in the blink of an eye, it seems. And so the fact that The California events were kind of legacy inverters that were connected, 10 years ago or so. We can understand some of those challenges, but when you've got brand new facilities just commissioned, months before the event happened, that raises a big red flag, right? And so something's happening that's allowing these problems to propagate, and not just old facilities, but also new facilities. So we went in, did a pretty extensive analysis there. And then in 2022, Odessa number 2, return of the Odessa disturbance happened. The event 2,500 megawatts, like I mentioned earlier, and that's nearly the size of their largest allowable event, right? The point where the rubber band snaps, right? And so that put everyone on very high alert, and was really a similar look and feel to a large scale event that happened in the United Kingdom in 2019, where you had combinations of bad things happening at the same time, right? Inverter-based resources tripping offline, synchronous generation tripping offline. That's, like I said, the recipe for a bad day. So that one was a very close call. And then we published similar event reports on a couple smaller wind events. We had that solar PV loss in Utah. We just released a report on some abnormally performing battery energy storage resources in California. So this is not just a solar problem. It's also a challenge with wind and batteries. They're all inverter-based resources. They're all inverter technology. And so we have findings from each of these that we can go into. I do want to give a shout out, right? The industry is doing a tremendous amount of work, right? It's not like we're all just sitting on our hands doing nothing, right? It's not as scary as it sounds, although we do need to stay, keeping up with the pace of change. We've got to stay ahead of the problem. But for example, ERCOT has done a tremendous amount of work, right? After that first event happened, and that was the first event we've seen in Texas, they stood up a task force. They got all the affected owner operators together and said, we're going to fix this. We can't let this happen. That takes time and education and outreach and all this stuff, and they weren't able to get fixes in place before 2022 event happened. But since then, they've actually fixed a lot of these problems, and they've updated their requirements. They've, sort of put, stops on some of these challenges moving forward, which is really, really exciting.
What were those root causes of Odessa 1 and 2?
Mostly inverter tripping. For a handful of causes. So in both reports, there are pie charts that explain all the different causes of reduction. The simple way the simplified version of that is individual inverters within the plant all simultaneously trip at the same time for an external grid fault, for voltage problems, phase jump problems, frequency problems, inverter DC side problems, again, very, very, very technical causes of tripping that we can then go in and analyze and work with the equipment manufacturers to try to bolster their product and, build a more robust product so that these things don't happen.
And are those mostly then firmware changes that, through software, the OEM is able to tweak some things? And is that an exhaustive process, or is it rather simple? Like, how long does it take to jump back in and mitigate these issues?
There's a mix. A mix of relatively easy firmware upgrades, software-based upgrades that can, alleviate some of the causes of tripping. For example, one of the inverter manufacturers has what they call a PLL loss of synchronism. It's kind of a broad-reaching, when the grid moves this much, this fast, we trip, because we want to make sure we don't go unstable as an inverter and inject a bunch of currents that could damage the power electronics, right? We can work to eliminate that, bubble wrapped protection system, but underlying that protection is a bunch of other protections that are more based on the hardware component capability, right? Inverter overcurrent protections that you absolutely cannot exceed. Inverter voltage protections. These equipment are built, the hardware is built to withstand certain voltages for periods of time, otherwise you fry the electronics, right? And so those are hard limits. Now we need to make sure that the protections are set right up against those limits. We put protection in place to protect equipment, not just to randomly put protection. That's kind of a new thing for the inverter world, right? Synchronous generation has done that for 100 years, right? We put protection so we don't fry the synchronous generator. we put it right below that limit and make sure that we never go past that protection. We keep that piece of equipment safe and reliable. The inverter world has looked a little bit more towards, well, what are the standards what are the requirements that are out there, and I will meet those requirements and I will set my curve to match that requirement. Not so much I will bring that curve up as much as humanly possible, as feasibly possible, to alleviate the possibility of a tripping event, right? So a little bit of it is, can we get the existing fleet to move their protections up to match equipment capability? And then do we need to actually build more robust products in the future to withstand some of these grid events that we're now uncovering? It's a mix of both, and we've seen very good progress on both sides, right? So some OEMs have seen what's happening, and they've actually gone back to their laboratory testing facilities and tried to enhance or raise some of these curves so that these normal grid events don't cause tripping. And we've actually seen a lot of success there. So again, I got to give credit to the many of the equipment manufacturers, because they're also sitting, watching what's happening, and immediately taking the findings and trying to run back to the lab and build a better product, which is kind of a great feedback loop that kind of doesn't get a lot of publicity, but is actually extremely valuable.
As we try to nail down how did we find ourselves in this situation, I think, the points that you've raised kind of take us back to the fact that industry, for the most part, is responsible for crafting much of our regulatory framework and our standards and the way that things perform in the field. Is it reasonable to say that we ran before we walked on some of this stuff when we raced to deploy early on, and then found out that maybe we should have spent more time on the standards at the front end? Like, how do I square all of this with why the bad things happened and what we maybe should have done differently?
There's multiple types of standards, right? We have to be really kind of clear on that, right? So while NERC is a standards organization, we write performance-based standards that apply to certain entities. We also have equipment standards, right? Things like IEEE standards, IEC standards, and those set requirements on how the equipment is designed and built and then delivered to the customers, right? And so those things work together. And for example, we didn't until 2018 get a really solid distributed energy resource standard in place, and not until 2022 did we get in kind of a equipment capability and plant capability standard on the IEEE side for bulk system plants, right? Just last year, essentially. And so, yeah, we've been connecting plants for many, many years before that time. And now we collectively in the industry are going, how are we going to adopt and implement these new standards that'll really bolster, the resource base moving forward? Those things work together, right? We're not going to sit around and wait for standards before we implement product. We also have to keep up with the pace of change, though, right? So it's this pace of change, and I start to sound like a broken record, but the pace of change is what the challenge really is. And I think we all collectively know that, and we just have to manage that, right? That the grid, collectively is not used to this pace of change. We haven't experienced this pace of change for the last 100 years. And you hear that saying, I'm sure it's maybe been brought on the podcast here in past interviews, but we're undergoing the pace of change under the next 10 years that we experienced over the course of the last 100 years, right? And so this hockey stick of change, and that's hard to keep up with on many, many fronts, right? And so did we run a little bit too early? Maybe you could say that, right? But it's almost inherent in the way that businesses run, right? And the way the grid is run, the way the product is designed, et cetera. So we just have to accommodate that and try to keep up with it.
I think this is an important conversation to have too, because obviously my audience is made up of, the clean energy developers and asset owners and EPCs and the people on this side of the fence. But as utilities often receive the barbs for going slow and being risk averse and not adopting new technology and not diving in head first to implement renewable energy or whatever, these are real concerns. And this is why when you're talking to those engineers, whether at the transmission level or distribution level, saying like, we really have to figure out these challenges, and it terrifies me what some of these assets are doing on the grid. whereas it's not all of them, but enough of these incidents do raise major issues for utilities and grid operators. So I don't think we should overlook that. If you want to change that narrative and build better standing with utilities, that yes, I'm going to perform the way that I say I'm going to in the field, you have to take in this advice from NERC, and not advice, but really directive from NERC on changing settings and being more reliable. So I think that gets to the crux of why this is something that we need to be talking about, and maybe sends us really well into other markets as well. So is this something that's happening around the world? Are other countries and grid operators dealing with similar challenges as they see higher penetration of IBRs? You mentioned UK, but think of an Australia, which is dealing with a ton of rooftop solar on the distribution system, but also a big utility scale market as well. Are they having similar challenges?
Yes and no. I was at a recent event, and this topic actually came up. It was a U.S. based event, and really solid technical presentations, talking about a lot of these challenges. How are we going to overcome them? What are we doing? Why are they here? But there was a heavy audience of international members, right? And one of the international members stood up and said, "Why is this a problem here? This doesn't exist in the other parts of the world." There's some truth to that, but also, there are counter arguments to that as well, right? And what is that counter argument? While blackouts are really bad and we do everything we can to avoid them, they sure drive change, and they drive change very, very quickly, right? So, when you set aside the common blackouts, particularly in developing countries caused by a resource deficiency, right? I don't have enough megawatts to deliver, right? And you get into more of these complex cascading event type things, there's a lot to learn, right? So yes, Australia has a tremendous growth and penetration of inverter-based resources, both distributed as well as utility scale. They also had a blackout in 2016, right, that drove the regulator, AEMO, and all of the related party theirs into a series of reforms, updates, requirements, enhancements, etc. And they did that very, very quickly, and that sort of changed the overall marketplace around the whole world. Right, an equipment manufacturer that is delivering a product for the Australian market is very likely also delivering a product to the U.S. market and the European market, etc. They're building a product to meet the most stringent requirements that exist, and Australia sort of shot us into much more stringent requirements that had existed. And there's a lot to learn from each of these events, right? That a system can get hit with 80,000 lightning strikes, right, in a short period of time. 80,000, right? So that sends the engineering community into these heated debates of, well, how many faults can we withstand before we blow up an inverter, right? What is the right level and risk tolerance that we're willing to take, right? Those are very detailed, but they're based on an event that ended up causing a really, really bad day. Then you have the UK event. Lots of very interesting findings there, particularly around making sure we're looking at distributed generation and giving that enough credibility, right? When we're doing system studies, reliability studies, we need to account for what those are going to do. Germany had the 50.2 hertz problem, put out a bunch of settings that resulted in a bunch of resources tripping off, which causes the system to start swinging all over the place. And there's a handful of other events like this, right? So yes, these things are happening around the world in different, looks and feels, and we all kind of collectively learn from them all. Those are major events, right? Those are the blackouts that make the news in most cases, right? The things that we are trying to stay out ahead of, like I mentioned, are the faint signals. While they may be some of them are very strong signals, they're relatively faint signals. And we got to try and stay ahead of that curve.
To your point on blackouts usually lead to change, especially the big ones. That's part of NERC's own origin story, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, NERC became the ERO, Electric Reliability Organization for the U.S. and North America in 2005, I believe, after with a driving force being the 2003 blackout, right? So NERC had existed for many years, but took on that more formal role under FERC after the 2003 blackout. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that was a big one. So we had former FERC chair Pat Wood on the Texas Power podcast from Renewable Energy World some months ago, and he talked at length about the fallout from those widespread outages and how FERC reacted. So that's a really insightful conversation that you should definitely check out. I guess that leads me to are people in the industry, are the OEMs or the generator owners listening? Like, does it feel like this message is landing after dozens of these reports, after conversations like you're having with me right now? Do you think it's getting through beyond just those people that you're engaging with because they were involved? You need everyone to be listening to this message because they may be involved next. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a challenge that we face, right? So NERC has a jurisdiction, and we have entities that are registered under NERC, and we're very good at communicating with those entities through guidance material, alerts, these things. But it's that supply chain of involved organizations that also need to hear the message, right? So this type of outreach is very valuable, right? Because it's the EPC contractors, it's the development community, and then those types of entities are not registered entities under NERC, and so it's not very easy for us to push a button and push out a message to them, right? And so when we're setting protective relaying in a solar plant with a bunch of settings where we'll bring in a bunch of very knowledgeable experts, and we see a bunch of settings going, those shouldn't even be there. Like who set that? Who decided that protection was even needed in the first place? That community we need to get closer to, and that has been a challenge. So we're working with a lot of trade forums to try to spread the word and get that message out there beyond just the registered entities. They have obligations, they have responsibilities. Utilities must provide reliable customer or power to their customers. Generator owners must meet certain obligations. But we also need to make sure that the OEMs are providing a good product, the EPC contractors, the consultants, et cetera. They're all doing their part to make sure that all happens. And that's an important overall supply chain we gotta get in touch with.
Well, I'm glad that we got you on to talk about this too, because I'm hopeful that the audience that we have is the exact one that you need to be engaging with as frequently as possible. And maybe we explore getting you or NERC involved in the podcast at a fairly regular basis so that we can maybe rehash some of these events as they come and address, as you mentioned, that the changing dynamic for each one is their own little snowflake out there in the world that it's different than the last one and going to be different than the next. So Ryan, just as we wrap up here, what's the answer? What are some of these? We always talk about low-hanging fruits to try to spur some immediate action, but how do we make sure that this push for decarbonization, deploying clean energy assets, doesn't at the same time torpedo grid reliability, which we know for our utility listeners out there is their main charge. They've got to keep the lights on and they have to keep people safe. So green is good and clean is good, but it's still two in that stack of responsibilities for them. So where do you point to?
Yeah, and this is a very hot topic for the folk, the clean energy community, right? But also has to be put into the broader context of, risks posed to the grid, right? And so utilities are dealing with rethinking energy and resource adequacy. We're trying to build out better practices to handle extreme weather events that are not all that uncommon anymore. We've got to manage a retirement of a synchronous fleet and addition of these new resources in a really thoughtful way. We've got to ensure that the overall electricity system has a strong security posture, both from a cyber and a physical perspective. We have to build transmission infrastructure, which we know is so challenging to integrate renewables, but also just to serve a booming load of transportation electrification, heating electrification, data centers, crypto mining, all of these new things. We're then sort of being pushed to do that all in the cloud. We have the concept of virtual power plants and DER aggregators upon us. All of this stuff has to all be kind of put into a broader risk context, right? And so there's a lot happening out there in the system right now. But in this area, like you mentioned, there's this balance of speed of interconnection versus reliability, right? They don't necessarily have to be conflicting, but it's a delicate balance, right? If you move too fast, you start to cut corners a little bit, right? And what I mean by that is when there's mandates to get resources connected at a certain pace or to hit a target, oftentimes we may not get the most detailed model provided prior to that resource being interconnected. Having a bad model or an inaccurate model leads to studies that don't uncover or highlight potential reliability risks. And when we're pressured to interconnect the resource fast, we're maybe not running as many of those simulations as we historically have with the synchronous generation fleet, right? And we have to keep up with that pace of requirements changes, right? Where the world, the requirements, local requirements, even some of the NERC requirements that are now being revised and enhanced were written in a world of synchronous generation. And there's a lot of work going on across the industry to write new requirements that are clear, consistent, and applicable to inverter-based technologies. And equipment manufacturers, even developers and EPC contractors, consultants, they oftentimes want those requirements. Just tell me what you want me to do and make sure they're clear and appropriate for the technology that I'm interconnecting, right? That allows us to speed up, actually, right? We want to go fast. We actually need clearer, better requirements as opposed to no requirements, because that makes sure everyone knows what everybody's doing and we're connecting the dots appropriately. We then get to the point of commissioning, right? Where it used to be that if I'm commissioning a 800 megawatt coal plant or a natural gas plant, I've got a utility person on site, making sure everything is done right, checking the settings, checking the protection systems, doing all that. That no longer really exists, right? These commissioning processes are very fast, often complicated and slowed down because of other regulatory things outside of say the NERC regulations. But we need to make sure that we are setting things correctly, checking the boxes, running through the checklist, making sure everything is as it was planned and studied. Because what we have is, a good example that some of my colleagues are starting to use is, we're studying the grid as if we're connecting a bunch of I'll say Maseratis, and in reality we're connecting a bunch of Hondas or something. I don't know, not knocking on any one technology, but you get the point, right? We think we're bringing a whole lot of horsepower and we're connecting something that doesn't have all those bells and whistles turned on, right? And that's a risk. And why is that happening? Well, because at the time of commissioning, things are falling by the wayside, right? And so throughout that whole interconnection process up to actual real-time operation, we have to make sure that we are checking the boxes.
Do you feel that developers, asset owners, OEMs, transmission owners are one, incentivized to care about this issue enough? And two, is there a single stakeholder of those in the value chain that bears more responsibility than the others? Or do you feel that this is shared across the spectrum?
Yeah, I think we have equal, it's equal responsibility. There's no one entity in the supply chain that's at fault, right? We all have to be, kind of players here on the field supporting this across the full spectrum. So, OEMs are incentivized, definitely incentivized to care, right? And I gave some examples, right? They're making improvements to their product as they learn new things. We hope they are, and a lot are. We know they are, because no one OEM or sector, the solar sector, the wind sector, the batteries, whatever, wants to be the cause of the next blackout, right? And they can very much, we can all get behind that. They want to provide a high quality product at least cost, though, right? And so, what drives quality? Regulations, requirements, and markets, right? And so there's on our side of the shop, we try to ensure a adequate level of reliability by establishing a certain level of requirements, and the utilities also have the responsibility to establish their own requirements for ensuring reliability of their grid. And so OEMs are rolling out products to meet requirements fundamentally, right? Tell me what the requirements are, I will provide a product that meets just that. right? And oftentimes we'll may provide a world-class product to meet the Australian market, but what gets delivered in the US is only going to meet what the requirements are for that US customer, right? And so we've got to bring up requirements, and the OEMs are also saying that. Help me understand what the requirements are and I will meet them. Make sure they're fair, reasonable, and not technically impossible, which no one wants to do, but we have to make sure they're there, right? And this, I think the same thing goes for the developers and the asset owners too. They want to do the right thing. They want to comply with the requirements. They want to continue producing megawatts and making money. It allows them to interconnect to the system, and it also helps them establish contracts in terms of conditions with their OEMs when they understand what the obligations are on them, right? And so it's oftentimes a pass-through of, well, here are the requirements I have to meet, so I got to make sure I'm buying a product that also meets those requirements. Can you meet those requirements, OEM? Right? So the asset owners and the developers also want to do the right thing. And to me, it comes down to, do we have enough kind of clear, consistent, and appropriate requirements in place for these entities? And in many cases, there's a balance here around having a uniform set of requirements, say at like the NERC level, but oftentimes we need some flexibility for system-specific challenges and attributes. The Texas grid, being in more of an islanded network, doesn't have or has many different challenges than, say, the Eastern interconnection or the Western interconnection. They all have their own unique challenges and need to have kind of localized requirements for those specific reasons. So there's always there has been, and I think will be some balance there of uniformity across the nation or across the world versus system specific requirements as well. So that's, I think, my broad answer to that question is everyone's incentivized, everyone wants to do the right thing, but there are things we can do to try to help in that regard.
Can you help us understand where the work stands now to elevate some of these standards and regulations? I know FERC recently issued Order 901. If you could explain that a little bit and what might be on the horizon, both at the FERC and NERC levels.
Sure, yeah. And so, the usual disclaimers, make sure to read those orders in their entirety to understand the details. They're multiple hundreds of pages.
This whole episode's going to have a disclaimer on it, Ryan. Do your own engineering due diligence, and this is not to supersede any of that work.
Exactly, yeah. And so there's really two or three actually important directives, orders, if you will. There's FERC Order 2023, which was focused on enhancements to the interconnection process, trying to overcome the interconnection queue backlogs. But in there's quite a few reliability items, things like providing certain types of models, having accuracy during the interconnection process, truing up data through the process, making sure you have ride-through capability. A lot of that is buried in that Order 2023. There was also a directive order to FERC to modify our registration criteria to sort of bring down, we have our bulk electric system definition, but there's a fairly decent resource base under that BES definition. So registering those entities and bringing them into the fold. So there's a lot of work going on the NERC side through rules and procedures changes and stakeholder engagement to modify our registration criteria and then eventually modify our standards applicability. And then Order 901 was a fairly recent order directing NERC to make fairly significant enhancements to the reliability standards, the NERC reliability standards around IBRs specifically, and really touched on 4 or so key areas. IBR performance, so making sure that these resources are performing in a reliable manner, data sharing, both from a disturbance monitoring equipment capability, but also a modeling perspective, making sure that the utility side folks are getting the information they need to be able to conduct their reliability assessments, fairly extensive modeling and study type enhancements around the quality of the data that's provided, the models, and then how those models get used to run the reliability studies that ultimately are what we use to make decisions to plan the grid and then to operate the grid in real time, right? So that often gets overlooked, but that's a whole topic in and of itself, of the criticality of that those models and that data and those studies that are run, because that's what keeps the lights on at every moment of every time, is the quality of those studies. And so there's quite a bit of work in that regard as well. So that's really kind of an overview of the FERC NERC directives that are really particularly related to this topic.
You mentioned quickly the expansion of registration and I guess extending certain standards to a new class of projects. I'm assuming of smaller generating capacity. I don't know if that includes the rumblings that I've heard within the industry of some proposed standards extending to smaller projects. And I think project developers, there's some buzz in the community that this could have a pretty big impact to the segment. And I'm not describing that super well, but I can imagine that you know what I may be touching on here.
Yeah, and a lot of that is still in the works, I'll say, right? So we submitted a work plan to FERC that lays out a 3-year plan as directed by FERC, which is, modify our registration criteria so that we have that new definition of who has to be registered, what are they called, et cetera. Then we've got to go out and find those entities, register those entities, bring them into the fold. They haven't historically been within NERC and the regional entities jurisdiction. And then we've got the last phase, which is the standards applicability and making them, having the applicable standards modified so that they can comply with those standards appropriately. And so that, kind of longer term, that phase 3 of standards applicability is the hot topic. That's the interesting one. What am I going to have to comply with, and what implication will that have on me as an asset owner? Right? That's still very much in the works, right? Nothing has been really put forward or released that's going to describe that. And that's also will go through our standards process, which is a stakeholder driven process, right? So there's quite a bit of work to be done before we know that kind of final answer. I will say that we, NERC and the regions, are being really thoughtful around understanding that a lot of these facilities are legacy facilities. They've been out there for a long time. They were built with specific needs or specific capabilities, for example. They can't likely do what the latest and greatest inverter rolling off the production line can do today, right? So there are conversations around, grandfathering and what are we going to do, exemptions, some of those things. But there are sort of basic reliability things that can be done, right? Providing data, right? Making sure that the utility knows what's inside of that facility in terms of the inverter technology, the plant configuration, all of that stuff, to make sure those models and studies are right, to ensure that if I've got 100 plants that now came into the fold that have the same make and model of the inverters that caused all the problems in these past events, the utility can go be a little bit more proactive to say, let's fix some of these things. We know it's a basic software update. Just get that software update for us and the problem goes away, right? So all of that is has a foundation in just basic data sharing. So making sure that that's a requirement, right, goes a very long way, right? And it doesn't require significant changes to an asset base, right? No one's trying to make all of these existing fleets swap out the inverters or swap out the panels or anything like that. Or we know that will shut down or bankrupt a facility, right? And we do everything we can to make sure that we've got reasonable and just requirements out there that ensure reliability.
Well, and developers, of course, will immediately think, how is this going to impact my margin, especially for smaller projects where it's thinner? Is this going to require enhanced telemetry, redundant infrastructure at the meter, or, as you mentioned, the swapping of components like inverters and so on. So your point to them is engage with us and be part of the stakeholder process.
Absolutely, yeah. And we have processes designed to allow for each entity and each sector to have a meaningful voice at the table, right? So engage and get involved and share that voice. It helps end up with a much better product in the end anyways.
I think that's a really good to be continued and a good opportunity for you to come back on the podcast sometime soon to talk about that regulatory and stakeholder process. Ryan Quint, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Ryan Quint for joining the podcast. Factor This is a production of Renewable Energy World and Clarion Energy. Join us every Monday as we break down solar's biggest stories with industry leaders who actually move the needle. And please leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Factor This from Renewable Energy World.